To understand the context of the so-called 100 Days, the actual 110 days between Napoleon's arrival in Paris on March 20th, 1815, and the reinstation of, or restoration of, Louis XVIII on the 8th of July, 1815, a period of 110 days, we actually have to go back to 1814. Now, by 1814, Napoleon is on the back foot. Russia has shown him to be human, fallible. He is no longer invincible. And Wellington and the Anglo-Portuguese Spanish armies are slowly liberating the Iberian Peninsula. So he is, in two fronts, looking weaker. Previously humbled to certain degrees, Russia, Austria, and Prussia come together with Britain to form the Sixth Coalition, sensing blood in the water, sensing that there may be a chance here to stop Napoleon, to eliminate Napoleon. Napoleon gathers what's left of his Grande Armée and turns to face the Allies at Leipzig, where he is, for the first time fundamentally on the battlefield, actually defeated. In the aftermath of Leipzig, the Allies invade France. The Russians, Prussians, and Austrians from the east, the British, the Portuguese, and the Spanish from the south. France, it should be noted, is utterly sick of war. 1 in 10 men of fighting age are dead, and another 2 of those 10 are maimed and wounded. So we are seeing a situation not unlike the European powers saw at the end of the First World War, where literally not a family has not been touched by this conflict in one way or another. Now, the French armies do their job. They face down these invading forces. It should be noted that the invasion from the east, the Prussians, Austrians, and Russians, are much more brutal than the invasion from the south, coming from Wellington and his Anglo-Portuguese Spanish army. The Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians, you will remember, had all recently suffered at the hands of the French. They had been occupied. And so they see this as an opportunity to wreak their revenge in a way that Wellington has not been, right? The British have not been occupied during the Napoleonic Wars, and therefore he can afford a little bit more restraint. The French armies, as I said, do their job. They defend well, but the Allies use their higher numbers to push forward while retreating whenever Napoleon himself is in the field, denying him his craved set-piece battles and nullifying his advantage. Paris falls on the 30th of March, and Napoleon abdicates on April 6th. He's gone, which relieves the Allies with a much bigger question. Now what? Now, in the bigger sense, this question is going to take months to answer, and it's going to take the form of the Congress of Vienna to answer it. But in the smaller sense, the question of now what do we do with this man who has terrified Europe, this man who tossed almost all understanding of government and right on its head, installing in some ways a much more advanced, much more progressive system, in other ways rolling back the advantages of the French Revolution, or the advances of the French Revolution. And so the solution is the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which, in addition to formalizing Napoleon's abdication, sends him to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean, which will become his private island kingdom. Napoleon has his own little private army, his own personal bodyguard of 600 volunteers from the Imperial Guard, and he and them are shipped by the British to Elba, where he feigns delight at his new kingdom and bides his time. Less than 10 months later, Napoleon slips past his now complacent British guards in the brig Inconstant, surrounded by a small fleet containing his guard. He lands near Cannes on the Côte d'Azur in southern France on the 1st of March, 1815, determined to enter Paris by March 20th. The ordinary people of France were largely nonplussed by his return. They were shocked, they were surprised. Some, the diehard Bonapartists, of course, were delighted, but most were still recovering from a quarter century of conflict and are still trying to piece their lives back together. And to have him return is at best a surprise, sometimes a welcome one, sometimes an unwelcome one. The army, however, was largely delighted. Louis XVIII had cut back the funding, had cut back the French army, and Napoleon's return was seen as a way to regain that lost glory. Troops in his way largely go over to him en masse. Within 6 days, his force of 600 guards and 40 Polish lancers had become 8,000 infantry, a full regiment of hussars, and 20 cannon. 8 days after that, he has 14,000 men, many of whom had been directly ordered to stop him, but had gone over to his side instead, had joined him instead. Good to his word, Napoleon arrives at the Tuileries on the morning of March 20th to find that Louis XVIII has departed Paris for the Allies. In his wake had also left many nobles and government officials, leaving the French government largely headless and Paris with 20 million francs fewer in its banks. Napoleon immediately starts claiming he desires nothing more than peace while preparing for war. Attempting to prove his bona fides as a reformed man, he pushes through a number of reforms and job-creating efforts, winning the Parisian mob especially over to his side, at least to a certain extent. It was not enough for other portions of the country, however, which erupted, most notably the royalist Vendée, forcing Napoleon to commit 20,000 reliable soldiers, including 2 full regiments of the Young Guard, to its suppression, troops that he would categorically miss in the Waterloo campaign to come. Napoleon finds himself hampered by numbers. France simply does not want another war, nor can it afford one. Paris has less money than he thinks it does, and when he puts out the call for troops, he does not get the numbers he wants. A recall to the Eagles that it was hoped would produce over 100,000 troops produces half of that, many of them press-ganged and therefore functionally useless as frontline units. By June, only 142,000 of the nearly 500,000 called out were in place and ready, led by only a few of his marshals. Now, in the face of this, Napoleon has 3 advantages. The army that takes the field in the northeast, the army that would fight the Waterloo campaign, was, by his assistance, entirely made up of veterans, so he could trust every single one of them. Second, he has his own reputation, both within and outside of France. And third, he has his superb intelligence and counterintelligence corps, which is so powerful that it makes the Allies hesitant to act on concrete information. Tied to that also is perhaps his most diplomatic masterstroke of the period, his leaking of the secret treaty signed in January of 1815 by Britain, France, and Austria to counterbalance an ascendant Prussia and Russia. By leaking this, he sows a seed of distrust between the British and the Prussians. It will not come to anything, but it is one that scholars since have tried to make several mountains out of small molehills. Now, the one thing the Allies were sure of was that Napoleon had returned, and that could not stand. Each committed 150,000 men, but the Austrians, and especially the Russians, were too far away to matter if Napoleon struck quickly. If he did, and he would, it would come down to the Prussians, under the 72-year-old fire-eater Prince Blücher, and the Anglo-Dutch, under the Iron Duke, although he hadn't earned that nickname yet, Field Marshal Wellington. Blücher and Wellington know Napoleon was coming for them, but they don't know where and when he would strike. And thus they adopt the traditional aspect of an army or 2 armies waiting for movement. They array their troops and their forces across a wide area, but with plans in place to concentrate and support each other when Napoleon finally strikes. He does so on the 15th of June. With his entirely veteran army, he crosses the Sambre River into the Netherlands, launching what will become known as the Waterloo Campaign. 87 days into his 100 days, he casts the die. It will not go as well for him as it did for Caesar.